A South Carolina law enforcement division, better known as SLED, has closed its investigation into Mother Emanuel AME Church, and they say there's no wrongdoing in the way the church is handling money coming in after the tragedy at the church on June 17, 2015. In this special edition of Quintin's Close-Ups, I sit down exclusively with attorney Andy Savage, who's also representing victim Felicia Sanders and her granddaughter. And be sure to download the free Quintin's Close-Ups app in your Apple or Google Play stores. And listen to this interview Thursday on iHeartRadio. Andy Savage, welcome back to Quintin's Close-Ups.
Always good to be with you, Quintin. What a great way to start a day.
Well, I know that, there's some developing news right now coming from, obviously, Emanuel Church. And this is the headline from CNN. It reads this: no charges against Charleston Church targeted by white supremacists. Investigators probe use of donated funds. And let me read the actual article to you. It reads this: in an investigation into the handling of funds at Charleston's historically black Mother Emanuel AME Church found no evidence of wrongdoing, investigators said. The church was the site of a 2015 massacre by white supremacists who killed 9 African Americans during Bible study. In the aftermath of the killing, Emanuel African American Episcopal Church received millions of dollars in donations. State investigators earlier this year opened a probe focusing on how donations were used, but the details of the investigation weren't initially revealed. Investigators, that is, have completed their review, finding no evidence that funds were mishandled. And this is coming from SLED agent and spokesperson Tommy Crosby. Investigation closed. How do you, Andy Savage, look at this as an attorney? And how do you look at it as really a friend to many of these victims and family members?
Well, that's a criminal investigation. I'm not sure how much in depth that investigation was. They didn't look at any bank statements. They didn't look at any of the checks of the many donors who gave these millions of dollars. You would think they'd start off by looking at the checks and seeing what the check said. Was it addressed to the church? Was there a memo on it? We know, Quintin, that the families of the victims received envelopes addressed to them that were sent to the church, the street address of the church, but with their names on them, that were open. And the money was missing. We know that the envelopes that they received that were not open had donations in them. We know that the church claims that they received over $3 million, but we don't really know that. There are a number of witnesses who saw money being diverted. We don't know whether those people were interviewed or not. We don't know whether they were asked to show their bank statements. We don't know whether they were asked to show their lifestyle at that time that may have been affected by this newfound money. Now, the reason we didn't do anything in the very beginning is because this is the church. You take Felicia or Polly, the 2 adult survivors, their families for generations had attended this church. They had no animosity towards this church. And they fully understood when people were literally just throwing money at the church in the front of the church and envelopes and all. It was such mass confusion and they were in such grief that nobody wanted to do anything with the church. But then the arrogance of the leadership of the church started to show through. And that was almost done immediately. The arrogance of the pastor, of Reverend Goff, in not attending to the spiritual needs, not financial, spiritual needs of these people. Never once going to the home of Felicia Sanders, who survived the 77 shots, whose granddaughter at 11 years of age survived the 77 shots, and wandered through this bloodbath with this dazed look on her face, as is evidenced by the body cam units of the first responders. Never once spoke to her. It's just unbelievable. So you had a real failure of this church and the leadership of the church that continues today, by the way, of totally abdicating their responsibility from a spiritual side in dealing with the grief that these families suffered. Now, on top of that, separate but on top, is the financial issue. millions of dollars? I mean, does the leadership of the church really believe that these people all over the world sent that money for their benefit? Goff wasn't there. Manning wasn't there. How much did it cost to repair the damage of the bullets that went through the bodies of these people, that spread their blood all over the floor? How much did it cost the church to clean that up and maybe paint the wall where the bullets ricocheted? Do they really believe that they're the victims? When the arrogancy of the leadership of the church travels throughout the country, whether it's Pittsburgh or some other place, and they present themselves as victims, yet they ignore this 11-year-old child who has been hospitalized, who has spent months in institutional care as a result of the psychiatric damage she suffered on June 17th. Where is the support, spiritual, financial, social, any way you want to conceive, by the leadership of this church? People go to Emanuel these Sundays this month and still donate money.
Sure.
So it's not just the money that was received originally. And nobody's looking to get rich on this. No lawyer that I know of in helping the victims of this has received a penny or asked for a penny. We're all doing this out of the compassion and the belief in these people.
And these people.
Spend 5 minutes with Felicia Sanders and tell me that she is not continuing to be a grieving mother. You know, she was sitting at a table much like this one. She was sitting here. Her 11-year-old grandchild was sitting here. 87-year-old Aunt Susie was sitting there. 26-year-old Pawanza Sanders was sitting here. They were at the third table in the basement of the church.
Right.
An hour's worth of studying the gospel according to Mark. This fellow gets up without saying anything, shoots her pastor in the head. 76 shots followed that one. Blood splattering all over the basement of that church. Blood splattering all over her. All over everyone who was there. Brain matter being thrown out on the table. And Pawanza, after being shot, stands up and says, "You don't need to do this. We mean you no harm." Bam! Her son, her blood and flesh, spilled all over the table, spilled all over the floor. Her granddaughter, 11 years of age, underneath her, that she's suffocating. She's afraid she's going to injure her permanently by suffocating her. "Don't move, honey, don't move, honey." Bam, bam, bam. He thought that they were dead because they were covered with so much bodily fluids and blood that he passed them by. Now, the church, Reverend Manning, Reverend Goff, the bishop and the other leaders of the church has yet to talk to them. Has yet to express the sympathy of the church in the Christian way he professes to be. Has yet to carry out his duties as their spiritual guide, as their spiritual leader. Now set that aside. Think about that for a minute. As if he is the victim. As if the church, as if the concrete and wood and paint is a victim. And is ignored, totally ignored, 100% has ignored the spiritual needs of Felicia, the spiritual needs of the young child, and has totally ignored the fact that this child has suffered much more than anyone else associated with those slaughters in terms of psychiatric need. It is despicable. It may not be criminal, but it's unconscionable of what the leadership of that church has done or hasn't done.
Originally, when the money was flowing in, how much was that?
SLED can't tell you. Nobody can tell you. because there was no accounting. But I've got to say,
Yes, sir.
that can be forgiven, because no church at that time had gone through an experience of that, and they were overwhelmed. Now, it's pretty questionable why they fired the bookkeeper, because the bookkeeper says that she was fired when she asked for a more structured accounting of the funds, and she gets fired. So you have to wonder what was going on. But even so, the chaos that existed at that time, that's not the issue. The issue is the money that was accounted for. We agree that it wasn't all accounted for, but just the money that was accounted for. The church thinks that they're entitled to that. You know, what did the church do? How was the church victimized? The church is made up of its membership. It's not made up of concrete, metal, and wood. Those repairs could have been made for a minimum amount of money. Where is the damage to the church? The damage is to the individuals who were present. As I said, Felicia, Polly, and the child. 77 shots ringing in their ears to the extent where if there's a loud noise today, Felicia jumps. The child jumps. Because it just brings back the memory of that. Every time they hear a siren, what do you think they think of? You know, it's just unbelievable how callous Reverend Manning and the other leaders of that church have been.
And you talk about the original money not being accounted for. Is the money that's currently coming into the church being accounted for now?
Who knows? You know, the church hasn't said a word. They think that as of a specific date, a specific time years ago, they just stopped thinking about the victims of June 17th. There is no accounting of what all the tourists, of all the people who have come to Charleston who want to go to the church and see the scene where this horrific act took place, and they leave a donation. You know, did SLED ask any of them? Did the investigators ask any of them what was their intent in providing these monies? Do you think anybody, any one of the people who donated money, any one of them, did not intend for that money to be for the benefit of those families whose loved ones were lost, or even more particularly, those who survived? You know, Felicia, her granddaughter, and Polly lived it. They were there. They're the ones whose blood was splattered on. They're the ones who smelled the firing of the weapon. And to totally ignore 2 out of the 3 survivors, what's the explanation for that? You know, and till my dying day, I will continue to fight for justice for Felicia and her granddaughter.
Let me get to the other side, because Emanuel AME pastor Eric Manning said that the church, quote, has always handled donations in a way that they were intended, and that the investigation and the media scrutiny had added more trauma to a church community still trying to heal from the tragedy. He told CNN, quote, this is Reverend Manning's quote, "I thank SLED for their attention to this issue. I am prayerful that this will continue to aid in the healing process by all who were directly and indirectly impacted by the horrific event of June 17, 2015. Let me go back to that, Andy. He says this, quote, "The church has always handled donations in the way that they were intended."
False statement. Reverend Manning's a phony. He's a bully. He is unconscionable when it comes to attending to the needs of these victims. He goes all over the country as if he was the victim of these events, and he has ignored 2 of the 3 survivors. So what does he think these donations were for? To paint the church? To repair the termite damage? You know, what does he think the intent of these donors were? For him? He wasn't there that night. He wasn't anywhere close to it. He's not personally affected by this. Reverend Goff? How much money did he get? How much money did the district get? And were they victims? Were they there? No. It's just that, when money gets put on the table, everybody wants to scoop up theirs. But if you look at the spiritual attendance to the needs of the people who were there, it becomes very clear what the leadership of the church did in 2015 and has continued to do every day until today. Ignore the needs of those most in need, the victims. I mean, this 11-year-old child, how much more innocent can you be? And how much more damage could she have received that will last with her the rest of her life? I mean, everything that this child sees and does is through the prism of June 17th.
Okay.
Reverend Manning, you and your colleagues in the church, you ought to take the time to look at the body cameras of the first responders. And maybe then you can begin to grasp the need of the victims. Just traveling the country and sort of immersing yourself in this glorification of victimization that you seem to profess, you were not a victim. You were not there. There were 3 people who survived that event. 3 people were there who heard the gunshots, who smelled the gunpowder, who heard the words of the killer, who heard the words of those who were groaning in their dying moments, who heard the words of Felicia Sanders, who heard the killer talking to Polly Sheppard about how he wanted her to spread the word around the world. Those are the victims. You're not.
Andy, is there possibly 2 accounting books at that church that we don't know about?
The SLED agents told me that they hadn't been able to see any of the bank statements. That's what they told me. They told me they didn't see any of the checks. They didn't talk to any of the people who donated money. But again, I've got to come back to, it's the same crew, leadership of the church, that ignored the spiritual needs. That's why we go to church, right? Because that's where we gain this peace. Right? Anybody who sat in the sanctuary of a church, a building, a structure, you find peace. And you have an opportunity for self-reflection. Felicia and Polly were banned from coming into church in the days following this event. They weren't given free access to it. Oh, the media hounds were all over the place, but they weren't allowed in. So you got to look at the finances through the prism of their first obligation is to meet the spiritual needs of their flock. And they just didn't do it. And they haven't done it till today. So if you're that disassociated with your primary job of rendering to the care of your flock, the spiritual care of your flock. Felicia's saying, why did this happen? Why did this happen to me? Why did this happen to my son? Here we were in prayer on this Wednesday night. Here we were, God knows we were in prayer, trying to learn more, to be better people. And then the other thing that the church ignored was that when we have a personal tragedy, who do we look to? We look to our church, but we also look to our friends. I know in personal situations of death and illness in my family, my friends come around me and give me comfort.
Sure.
Felicia's friends were murdered. Those who she would have sought comfort in by their presence and their caring were dead. And, SLED and finances and all that sort of thing, that's one thing. But the spiritual, ignoring these people is just unconscionable.
You talked earlier about the church leadership, the stewards and the trustees at Mother Emanuel. How do you as an attorney view them, Andy?
Well, I think, as I say, money does strange things to people. So when there's a big pot of money, you start thinking, how can I use that money? You know, at the time, the church had a lot of termite damage. You know, there were other things going on in the church at that time. There's always a need for money. The question is it your money? You know, and what was the intent of the people who sent those checks? Did they really think that the money was sent to repair the termite damage of the church? Or for the personal interest, the traveling expenses, the living expenses of those in the hierarchy of the church? You know, are they still today receiving money in the name of June 17th for themselves? If you look at, again, always look back and see their primary need was spiritual. If they ignored the spiritual need, you can understand why they can justify thinking that the money was for them. You know, it happened right away. The full story has been told. I think Jennifer Hall's book is terrific. But this started immediately, right after the killings, where the fourth table, right? We talked earlier about Felicia being at the third table. The fourth table, Polly Sheppard survived.
Right.
And sitting with her was Ethel Lance.
Right.
Again, these people are 5, 6, 7, 8 generation members of the church. The leadership, Reverend Goff at that time, ignored not only the Sanders family, but Ethel's family, to the point where Ethel's children, despite their mother's love of Emanuel, had to pull up and have the funeral services in North Charleston at Royal Baptist. Doesn't that tell you something? They're not associated with Felicia in the sense of, you know, being aggrieved in the current situation, but it shows how everyone, not just Felicia and a granddaughter, but everyone was ignored by the leadership of the church. They were, you know, all about President Obama's coming to town. They were going to have a big announcement, and they took the role, the glorification role of being a victim. You know, so shallow, so thin in what they did.
Do you believe, Andy, that the community and the donors believe this SLED report?
Well, if you read the SLED report, you'll have to ask what little they did. You know, it's not like, I think basically what they said is, we know some money's missing, do you know where it is? People said, no, we don't know where it is. And, you know, the leadership of the church, the current leadership of the church showed what the money that they accounted for. Remember now, what the church acknowledged, not including all that was not acknowledged, what they did with it. But I don't know whether they saw the books. I don't know whether they saw the bank accounts. I don't know whether they looked to see how many other bank accounts there were. I know they didn't serve any subpoenas on anybody. You know, they didn't take it to the grand jury. They didn't go to get advice from, as I understand it, from the solicitor or from the attorney general. You can't blame SLED for that. You know, they have a lot of other things going on, and they figured this happened 4 years ago. And, you know, time has passed on, and we got a few disgruntled people. But the disgruntled people are not just Felicia. So Felicia didn't lead this parade. You know, read the reports. The people who were most aggrieved by it were members, a member, at least one, of the hierarchy, and the bookkeeper. So, again, let's not just focus 100% on the money. Let's look at the overall picture. You know, what's the primary obligation, duty, responsibility of the leadership of the church? That is to comfort those who have been injured by these events.
Now, you talked earlier about the current leadership and what they acknowledged as SLED and what they didn't acknowledge. What didn't they acknowledge in your mind?
Well, I have yet to hear that Reverend Manning acknowledges that it was his decision not to provide any funding to the 11-year-old child, even though he agrees that he received $3.5 million. He has yet to explain to the public why he took two of the victims, that is Felicia Sanders, seventh generation attendee at the church, received nothing. Their claim is because Felicia's son was killed and she received money for the son, that she doesn't deserve any money for her presence there. In other words, all the psychological damage that was done to Felicia by being present in this mass murder event, her presence there, her hearing, her tasting, her smelling, her seeing, her feeling, her touching of what happened that night means nothing to Reverend Manning. The 11-year-old child who was present, who heard, who smelled, who touched, who felt, that means nothing to Reverend Manning. Where did he come up with? Who gave him the wisdom to say, we're going to put $2 million or $2.5 million in the church's pocket and not share that or give that to the victims in this case? I don't know how he sleeps at night. He runs up to Pittsburgh as if he was Mr. Victim. What a phony. How shallow can he be as a leader in a church to act as if he represents the victim?
And as a disclaimer, I hope to get Reverend Manning on Quintin's close-ups as well.
Oh, I'd love to. Reverend Manning, why don't you sit down with me and we can have a little chat. We've had those chats before. I've asked you to support this child and to support Felicia, and you have denied that. You and your attorney, who I met with, not just on one occasion, you have denied any assistance to those most in need.
And I hope to get Reverend Goff on, as well as Bishop Samuel Green, if they're interested in coming on Quintin's close-ups, so that I can get their side of the story too. But earlier you talked about the expenses that were coming in, with the donations, living expenses and personal expenses. Do we have any evidence of that?
Well, in order to have the evidence, somebody has to ask for it and get it.
Okay.
SLED didn't. I don't know what SLED told me, that no money was sent to the district. I don't know, what the basis of that is. I really don't know. SLED told me that they haven't any information of the continuing money that is coming in today. They don't know the accounting of that. Reverend Manning hasn't said a word about that. And again, Reverend Manning, what was the basis for the arbitrary decision that Felicia and the granddaughter didn't deserve a penny? Yet you deserve $2 million? That'd be something that I think the public would be interested in hearing the explanation for that.
And, you talked obviously about termites and all the couple of other issues going on with the church. Are they actually using some of that money for the church?
Who knows what they're using it for? There's been no disclosure as to where the monies that they arbitrarily said is ours, what do they use it for? The rumor is that the church had a lot of termites. I think, some of the leadership of the church was saying that at the time. I know that there was a fund that was being developed at that time so that the disabled and elderly could get upstairs from the basement in the elevator. Right. I have the accounting of that on my desk. I know that those funds were raised independently of the tragedy of June 17th.
June 17th. What will Andy Savage, the notable attorney in Charleston, do next?
This is personal to me, okay? Mm-hmm. Everybody thinks, the Savage lawyer. This is not Andy Savage, the lawyer. This is Andy Savage, who's had a relationship with Felicia Sanders who is emotionally closer to me than my own sisters. That's how close I am to her. You know, I didn't know what happened that Wednesday night. Felicia woke me up Thursday morning. I was laying in bed, and I couldn't understand what in God's name she was talking about. I got out of bed, drove to her house, and basically stayed in that house for 2 weeks. These are my friends and loved ones. There are very few people in this world, and none outside of my family, who mean more to me than Felicia, the child, Felicia's sisters, Tawanza.
Right.
Tawanza was my friend.
Yeah.
Look on my wall.
Right.
See whose pictures are on my wall. Yeah. This is not Savage the lawyer. These are deeply ingrained in my soul. You know, Polly, I've known Polly for 30 years.
Yeah.
Ethel Lance, I knew for 40 years.
Yeah.
Her children,
Right.
I've known for 40 years. This is not a matter where Andy got called up because he's a lawyer. This is a matter because Andy was called because he's part of us. He's our friend. In Felicia's case, part of her family. You know, in many ways, I felt impotent about my legal ability because I'm too close to it. You know, it's hard for me to make non-emotional decisions in this case. So I speak today as Andy Savage, not Andy Savage, the lawyer, trying to figure out why the church leadership has lost its way. You know, in many ways I feel sorry for them because there is no explanation for their actions. You know, I want you to confront Manning and the other leaders of the church and say, why? What is the justification of paying the deceased families the money you paid them, $150,000, which is really a pittance for the loss, and that you arbitrarily carved out Felicia and her granddaughter? On what basis? You know, Reverend Manning, and the world knows that the damages suffered by this child who had to be hospitalized out of state for 4 months this year, and the cost of transportation, the hotel bills, the airline, all that Felicia and Tyrone had to come up with, and the church stand by with their arms folded and say, you're on your own? Forget the money part. Where's the spiritual sensitivity? Where are the Christian values? Where's the empathy for those who have lost? Where are the corporal works of mercy? Have you never heard of them?
And I know obviously they're constructing a memorial, I believe, for the church victims after that tragedy.
This monument?
Yes, sir.
You mean the $10 million?
Yes, sir.
To glorify the place where this incident took place? You know, to put a monument up there for the lives that were lost and those who are still suffering today, yet ignoring the needs of the victims who survived. They're going to put a bench there? Do they really think that a victim is going to come by and sit on a victim's bench and contemplate? I mean, you talk about cold. Now, is there a place to memorialize the event? Yeah, I'm sure there is, but let's get our priorities right. You know, are we going to put up a stone bench and ignore the immediate needs of the victims? I mean, as I say, what are your priorities? You know, don't say I'm a lawyer and I'm going to get a piece of the pie, because I'm not. I haven't charged these people as, these are my friends. Right? No matter what type of case it would be, my friends, I'm not going to charge a penny. I have no interest in the finances, but I do have a strong interest in this child being given every opportunity she can be to heal. I have a strong interest in Felicia, the grandmother, being given every opportunity to heal from the loss of her son. I mean, can you imagine, Quintin, looking across this table and seeing your child beg for his life, and then his head blows up with the bullets they keep crashing into him? Think about that. Contemplate that. Think about him. Last thing he wanted to do was to touch Aunt Susie. Last thing he wanted to do was to touch out and put his hand in the hair of his 87-year-old auntie. Think about this 11-year-old who, when the police arrived with their body cams, was walking in this daze because she wanted to get a cup of water for her uncle, Tawanza, as he laid there on the floor with his gasping his last breaths. Just let that sink in. Let it sink in that Felicia calls me the next morning. I get to her house. She cannot take her clothes off to shower. And looks me in the eye and she says, "This is all I have left of my son." Her clothes are 5 feet away from me right now. They're right behind me. As you look over my shoulder, those boxes are her clothes right here.
Wow.
They're in my office every day.
Wow.
Now, they've been taken care of so that there's no danger to have them here. But you tell me I'm their lawyer and that's why I'm fighting for? I have Taiwan's blood in my office with me every day. That morning she was immobilized. She was paralyzed because she didn't want to get in the shower and have the blood and bodily fluids that were all over her go down the drain. In her mind, that was terribly disrespectful to her child and to Aunt Susie. But that's what we're dealing with. And Manning and the leadership of that church in Goff, shame on you.
What else do you want from Reverend Manning right now?
You know, he ought to stand up and apologize for what he, as a leader of this church, has failed to do. Not what he's done, but what he's failed to do. You know, I think it's terrific, and I'm sure that the victims think it's terrific that he is going and expressing his sympathy around the United States when tragedies of a similar nature occur. But, you know, charity starts at home. And you can't go around the country with this pretentiousness of being a victim when you, one, you were not a victim, and two, you haven't taken care of the victims in your own church. So I'd certainly like him to acknowledge the shortfalls of what he, as a representative of the church, have done or failed to do. I'd like him to acknowledge the fact that he arbitrarily ignored the spiritual needs of his flock. And I'd like him to acknowledge that he arbitrarily divided these funds in a way that was consistent with the needs of the institutional church and not of the parishioners, and particularly not of the victims of this. And I'd like him to explain how you could put $2 million plus in your pocket and not contribute to the needs of treatment for this 11-year-old child.
Andy Savage, thank you so much for your time. And again, welcome back to Quintin's Close-Ups. And I hope to have all these people who were mentioned in this interview on here as well to get their side of the story.
I'd love to hear it.
Yes, sir. Same
Thank
here.
you, Quinn.
Thank you. Yeah.